sounds like a stupid question.
Probably is, because, yeah, go ahead. Skilled managers equals high morale, which equals all that cool stuff that you cannot pay for and you can't punish for. When you close off that feedback channel, you are not going to be able to hear the truth. In the first microseconds, your brain can't tell the difference between physical danger and what we call social danger.
I'm pissed off at you.
Me, specifically?
Well, just because you're my boss and all.
Employees tend to get promoted until they reach their level of incompetence. Go forward and don't suck. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Managing with Mind and Heart podcast. I am one of your hosts, Michael Nash, and with me is my co-host, my friend, my son, my partner, Ethan Nash.
Hello. Good to be here.
Good. Yeah, me too. It's I'm excited to continue this conversation. We are here to talk about conflict. We're here to continue our discussion. Our last podcast, we dug in to some definitions around conflict and why it matters that we work on this stuff in groups or relationships and all sorts of cool stuff. And Ethan, you linked us all to the blog, and I'm hoping that our listeners had a chance. If you're listening to this and you haven't had a chance to just take a look at that blog, I think it would be really helpful because there's some visuals in there. There's a graph that kind of helps you understand where we're going. But Ethan, I'm jumping in quick on this. So you ready to get going?
I'm ready. Yeah. By the way, that blog post is linked in the show notes of this episode and last episode. It'd be good to check out in advance, but I'm ready. Let's dive in.
Well, I don't want to go back and repeat too much, but let me just ask you, Ethan, just briefly, just to kind of get us ramped up again. Why does this matter? Why does it matter that human beings know how to navigate disagreement and conflict? Why does that matter?
Well, at the end of the day, we are a social species, and like any social species, there is conflict involved. And it's not that we necessarily feel good about conflict. In fact, it tends to bring our, fight, flight, freeze, fawn response to center stage. But we are a social species, and conflict is a part of life. At the end of the day, disagreement is a part of life because we're not all the same. Wow, imagine that. Mm-hmm. And so we have different ideas, opinions, values, even at times. So we have to embrace conflict because it's not going to go away. And so by working on this adaptive skill of navigating through conflict while staying connected relationally with people in a healthy way that leads to healthy outcomes is why it's so important. We need conflict. We need debate when it's done well in order to get to better decisions, better outcomes, and so on and so forth. So there's my essay.
Yeah, I couldn't have put it better myself. That's perfect. I agree. I totally agree. This is something we've got to master. We've got to get our head around how to do this for all the parts of our lives, our relationships, our work relationships, our relationship with our kids, with our partners, with everybody. So, yeah. So,
because let me ask you, what's the cost of not engaging in any disagreement, right? Just, I am going to not do it at all. I'm going to avoid it all, personally and professionally, just real quick.
Oh, yeah, no. Yeah, that's a really good question. The cost of not engaging in disagreement and conflict is, personally, the cost is I probably end up resentful. I don't get anything I want. I'm constantly not having my own needs met or my own desires met. I think in a relationship or a workplace, we're not getting to the good stuff. We're not working through stuff so that we get to better answers and better solutions. I think everything stays mediocre. I also think relationally, you just don't connect. You stay on this really surfacey, non-authentic level, and you don't get deep. So how's that for a start?
I think that's a good start. And I think that's well said. And what is the cost of engaging in this destructive conflict, really unhealthy conflict, right? If that is our MO, that is our default mode. Like, what is the results of that personally and professionally?
Well, I'm going to toss that one back to you first. So pretend I just asked you that. What is the cost of just doing this poorly?
Well, I'm glad you asked. That's a really good question. I mean, the cost of doing it poorly towards the side of it is harmful and destructive, like we're at each other's throats, criticizing the person and the character and each other's values, and it's not a focus on the task or goal at hand. There's a lot of ingredients of what unhealthy conflict could look like on the destructive side. I mean, I think that leads first and foremost to a lot of sadness, a lot of low morale, low engagement at the end of the day, diminished feelings of well-being. I mean, It doesn't feel good. And we've probably all been here before in our lives, right? We're engaged in a conflict and it doesn't feel healthy. It feels pretty destructive.
Yeah.
And that, again, I think first and foremost is a well-being issue. And that's what I'm most concerned about here. But on a practical side, in the workplace, you're also not going to be able to get to, I think, the decisions you need to get to, or if you do get to them, people are going to feel resentful and then undermine the decisions later. And so there's a few things to start with.
Yeah, I think you're right. Let's kind of jump into the styles. And you said last episode that there's 5 styles, and I want to just mention them, and then we'll spend some time talking through them. They are on the grid. Again, if our listeners want to check that out, you're going to see the x-axis and the y-axis. And these styles are based on where you would land on each of those spectrums. And so you're going to get higher or lower on the spectrum around holding tightly or letting go of your personal goals and what you want. And you're going to be somewhere on the spectrum of holding tightly or being more willing to let go of relationships. You're going to be somewhere up and down on each of those spectrums, and kind of where you land sort of dictates where you land on the grid, right? And so let's just mention these styles. You've got the person who's going to be really high or higher on the personal goals and lower on the relationship spectrum, and they're called the competitor. You've got the person who's going to be high on the relationship and low on the personal goals, and that's the accommodator. You got the person who's lower on both, and that's the avoider. You have the person who's kind of in the middle of both. They're called the compromiser. And the one we're trying to shoot for, and Ethan, I want to have you kind of dig into what this one looks like. But the one we're shooting for is called the collaborator, right? And that's the person who is higher on holding on to what they want, going for what they want, and also higher on maintaining the relationship. We call that person the collaborator. Ethan, how would you describe that style, the collaborator style?
I mean, one way to look at that is it is essentially the win-win orientation, where the idea, the mindset is neither of us have to lose here. Like, how can we get to a solution that we both like, that we both can support? And that's different, a little bit different than compromising, right? And sometimes, let's be realistic. Sometimes compromise is the way forward, but the goal is collaboration. With compromise, it's, hey, we're both going to lose a little here, but we can live with that to move forward. With collaboration is, no, there's enough slices of the pie for everyone here. We can get creative, think outside the box. So we both are walking away feeling like, yeah, this is good. I support this. The collaborator, they're going to be high in cooperativeness. They want to cooperate at a high level. And they're also going to be fairly high in assertiveness. And those two things aren't opposites in a sense. You can both be highly assertive and highly cooperative. And I think that's where the magic happens in collaboration. Now, the collaborator, again, is going to have a win-win orientation, both assertive and cooperative. And they're generally going to look to pursue an alternative creative solution that fully satisfies both parties, which is what I said. So I think that's some of the main punchlines with a collaborator. And I would add to that, they're going to take a general interest in exploring areas of disagreement, right? Not avoiding those areas of disagreement, but hey, why do we disagree here? What is going on here? And they're being curious about that. And throughout that process, they're actually learning from each other. And so the picture of how we're going to move forward in a win-win how we're going to move forward to a win-win solution starts to unfold itself through that learning and exploring and curiosity of our different viewpoints.
Yeah.
So how's that?
Yeah, it's great. And I as you say that, I'm picturing these two people in collaboration mode or a group of people in collaboration mode. And I'm imagining these adaptive skills that are showing up, right? I mean, they're obviously going to be really good listening and even deep listening, the kind of listening where you're saying, okay, hey, wait, tell me more. Even if the person's saying something absolutely opposed to what you think, instead of jumping into what you think, it's, hey, help me understand, explain that even more. So there's that kind of listening. Yeah. Lots of, we can get into that later, but lots of really, I think it's a high level way of disagreeing that really does require some really good, strong adaptive skills. Would you say?
I would definitely say, and in fact, that's going to be one of our future episodes here soon as we continue this journey of going from conflict to collaboration, is there's going to be specific adaptive skills people will need to practice to get here, skills that a team can practice to get here. And I think one of the main characteristics that I see on highly collaborative teams is there's a lot of questions. There's far more questions than there are statements throughout that, because again, we're exploring and we're learning from each other.
Yeah, there's questions, there's statements, I like something I want to go back to too. You mentioned kind of the difference between compromising and collaborating, and I think it's worth stating, and I like the way you said this, that depending on the situation, you want to be somewhere in that range. You want to be somewhere between compromising and collaborating. They're both good. Collaborating is better, of course. I just want to tell you this really quick story that I think illustrates this well. I had these friends of mine, and they, husband and wife, and they were remodeling their kitchen, and they were really in conflict. Like they really, really did not agree. And they both had their ideal picture in their minds about what this remodel was going to look like. And they were not compatible, the two different versions at all. And it actually got bad. It got heated. And it was a long month of them were, trying to work through this, and they were really trying to compromise. And that was what was interesting as I talked to them about this later. It wasn't working, but they really were trying to compromise. But there was a whole bunch of, I'm giving this up, and therefore you should give this up. And it was kind of going to end up being that we're both just sort of mutually, maybe equally unhappy compromise kind of thing. And what was really cool was they worked at it, and they actually arrived at a remodel that looked nothing like what either of them wanted. It wasn't a compromise. It was actually a brand new idea that they both loved. And it was a really good example to me of the difference there between compromising and collaborating, and the fact that they stuck with it. And if they hadn't stuck with it, I think they would have ended up compromising, and it would have been fine. But they wouldn't have been as excited and happy as they ended up being when they actually collaborated and came up with something really beautiful.
Yeah, that's a great example. Because again, the I think the key thing you're saying in there is there was a solution forward that nobody started with. Nobody came to the table with this solution. And that's often, I think, our orientation with engaging in disagreement is there's A and there's B. I want A, you want B. But the collaborator is the one that says, maybe there's a C here, or maybe there's a D. And so it takes staying super connected relationally in order to be creative. And so that's what I think we're aiming for here. So all that said, maybe let's talk about let's deep dive a little bit more into the different conflict styles. And so for a moment here, let's put aside the collaborator. Again, knowing that, hey, that's ultimately the goal, meaning that with all these other 4 styles that we're about to describe here, if each of them can make some adjustments, then they can get to a collaborator mode. How does that sound? Jump into great. These different styles?
Yeah, and if you don't know your style, you don't know which direction to go to get to collaboration. So this is why this matters, to kind of understand what your basic style is, your default mode.
Yeah. And again, in last episode, we explored some questions that you can work to answer for yourself that will help you reveal your style. But also I find just by walking through these different styles, people can pretty quickly recognize, yeah, I think that sounds like me. That's kind of my default mode.
Yep.
All right. The competitor, are you wanting me to talk about it? Because that's my general conflict style. And so
Well,
I can speak from experience here.
It's mine too. So, I would do a better job at it than you would, of course. Just kidding.
Oh, is that right? That's right. Well, I guess it's a competition, isn't it? Anyway, so the competitor, again, I'll just say this one more time, not to beat a dead horse here, but I encourage you to go to that blog post that we've linked because you're going to see that the grid there, and this will all make more sense. But the competitor, they are going to be someone that tends to be more assertive when in disagreement and less cooperative, meaning that they're going to be maybe more likely to pursue their own goals in this conflict at the expense of maintaining the relationship. They're more willing to kind of let go of the relationship to get to their goals. So again, a win-lose maybe orientation. And again, we're painting with broad strokes here, folks, but they're going to be more interested in winning, quote unquote, the conflict by being pretty clear in stating their position and then defending their position. So again, you can kind of see this competitive nature with it.
Right.
All right. Right. So I think that's kind of the bare bones of how a competitor would show up. And again, this is someone's style when they're not already exercising maybe self-control or practicing certain adaptive skills. This is when we're at our most raw state within conflict, if that makes sense.
Yeah, in fact, that's an important point. I think I've watched clients sometimes struggle with identifying their style because they kind of get mixed up between, when I get into conflict, I make myself stop and listen and ask questions, and that's fantastic, right? That's when you're using your adaptive skills. But to really identify your default mode, you want to think about, where do I default to, right? When I'm not at my best, when I'm stressed out. And so, yeah, this person's at their, when they're not at their best, they're going to lean into that kind of that win-lose style. You said something there. I just want to clarify. You said something about focusing on goals and being willing to let go of relationship. And I want to clarify that because that has been a little confusing at times. Think of it as, it's not so much letting go of the relationship, because when I hear that, I think suddenly I don't care about you, or I don't care about this relationship. It's more about not maintaining the relational aspect of that conversation, not attending to how you're doing, how the other person's doing. So I may still value the relationship, but in that moment, that's not showing up, right? I'm not going to be spending much energy or time on your needs or how you're doing or you being heard. I'm going to spend my energy and time on me being heard and me winning.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, without that extra bit you added there, it could sound like these people are heartless sociopaths or something like that, right? But that's not what's going on, right? They're not. Right. I don't care at all about relationships. It's just where they tend to lean towards. Yeah, like I'm more willing to take some risks with the relationship at the pursuit of what I'm trying to get out of this, my goals here.
Yeah. And think about what, so you're in a meeting with someone, you're in a conversation with someone who has this style. What behaviors are you seeing? I'll start with probably interrupting, right? I would say this person is a little more likely to cut other people off. And that's really right there. That's a really good example of what you're saying. There's a person who is cutting other people off to be heard, meaning they're more focused on what they have to say and what they want, and certainly not very focused on how the other person's feeling at that moment. What else? Like how do you know you're talking to a competitor or someone who's in that mode?
Yeah. And again, painting with broad strokes here, but maybe somebody that is more likely to just make some, more statements in defense of their point than to ask a lot of questions about the other person's point of view, right? Because they're defending their point of view, and they want that to be clear to you, kind of where they stand. They might be somebody that, anticipates in advance areas of disagreement that you're going to have, and then prepares the responses to those objections. Okay. Mm-hmm. So again, you can see some kind of that statement making throughout, right? Someone that might have the mindset or say out loud, hey, look, I got to stand up for myself right here. I got to stand up for what I want. Okay.
Yeah.
They might be somebody that is just going to show up a little bit more assertive. I mean, I guess that's the word. That's where the interrupting and stuff comes in. They're pretty assertive.
So yeah, you mentioned assertive. I think it's along that continuum, right? I mean, someone who's assertive doesn't necessarily have to show up aggressively, but you will definitely at times see competitors, in my opinion, crossing that line into aggressive. And like you said, that's interrupting. That's going to be raising their voice, more likely, certainly more likely than some of the other styles to get louder. I think another thing they would tend to do, and I say they as if it's not me, but it's me. It's that kind of appealing to some of these kind of fallacies, these arguments that really aren't valid. There's a Latin term, argumentum ad populum, which is that idea that, well, hey, a lot of people think this. So, I've talked to this many people, and so I'm right. I'm right because a lot of people think this, or the appeal to personal belief. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. So I'm right. So it's people that are more likely to engage in a lot of these kinds of arguments that are finely tuned to get the other person to give in and believe them, right? And accept their position. It's like litigation kind of approach.
Right. And so as we're going through these conflict styles, do some processing on your own here. Take a step back and think, hey, who on my team, in my workplace, might have this type of style? Who in my personal life might this style be their more default mode? Mm-hmm. And I think we'll start kind of uncovering some of the pieces here as you look at your team and your life. So that's the competitor. Some general characteristics maybe of that style.
Yeah. And one more thing on that, Ethan. One thing that's interesting is when you're in conversation with a competitor, what tends to happen is you tend to go more extremely into your style. So, for example, if a competitor is kind of getting, a little bit more aggressive or, a little more intense, and I'm a competitor, I am also going to kind of rise up to that. I'm going to tend to go there. I'm going to tend to also kind of get heated to sort of match, because that's sort of the one of us has to win feeling. And if you're getting louder, I'm going to get louder kind of thing. But if I'm an accommodator, which we'll talk about next, and you're a competitor, I'm absolutely going to more quickly and even more extremely go into my accommodation mode.
Yeah. And just remember that I hope there's no kind of shame that anybody's feeling about this, right? There are actually a lot of, benefits in your life and on a team to have someone that has a competitive nature to their conflict style, right? But at the end of the day, I mean, these styles are, and what you've learned about how to engage in conflict, I mean, at some level, that's served you some way in your life, right? That's you've developed this style because it has been beneficial for some reason. Okay, so again, I don't think there's necessarily a good or bad with any of these styles. It just is what it is. The idea here is how can we make adjustments so we can lead to the most productive outcomes when we're engaging in disagreement with others.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that. Grace and man, that's great. We've talked a lot about self-compassion in these podcasts and in our workshops, and this conversation here can lead to shame. And I mean, I don't want to just repeat what you said, but I just want to emphasize it. This is your default mode, and there's nothing wrong with that. This is, for example, I might not be a great listener. That doesn't make me a bad person, but I got a growth mindset. I'm going to learn how to be a better listener, right? That's the idea. So yeah, don't beat yourself up. Identify kind of where you are in your default mode and work from there toward, moving toward collaboration.
Good. How about the accommodator? How would you explain and describe the accommodator?
Okay, well, so where the competitor was high on goals spectrum and lower on relationship, this person's the opposite. They're going to be higher on relationship and lower on their own goals. And so they're going to be, in contrast to the win-lose orientation, they're going to be kind of lose-win in the sense that I'm willing to lose and I'm going to let you win. So they're going to be definitely emphasizing cooperation, over their own personal assertiveness. They're going to be emphasizing, go along to get along. I don't want to make waves. I don't want to push buttons. So I'm going to show up in a way that maybe much more easily kind of lets go of maybe what my initial position was, and maybe not certainly internally let go, but it's kind of that it's not really worth it to hold on to that or to pursue what I want. And so they're going to be definitely more focused on making sure the other person gets what they want, making sure that relationship stays strong in that moment at the expense of what they want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, imagine you're in a disagreement with this accommodator. What are some behaviors you might see? How might this show up at a practical level?
Yeah, I think, of course, as you said earlier, there's lots of different ways this shows up per person, but I think you're going to see, generally, I've noticed these folks have really good body language listening skills. Like they're going to do a lot of good listening with their, head nodding and eye contact, and they're going to look really open and pleasant. They're going to be displaying, I think, a lot of kind of relational generosity in the conversation. They're going to tend to be asking questions. They tend to show up in a really strong listening mode, but then I think what they'll tend to do is they'll move into kind of a peacemaking mode where either they'll state their opinion not very assertively. They'll do a lot more, well, I think maybe kind of things, as opposed to, no, this is what I want, or this is what I think. Or they might not state it at all. So, when the other person maybe doubles down and kind of repeats themselves or appeals to one of these fallacious arguments, I think the accommodator is going to listen and maybe not speak up and just kind of give in. One more thing, they might say things like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Or, oh yeah, you know what, you're probably right. Or, oh yeah, you know what, I hadn't thought of it that way. And they just don't come back to the table and stand up for themselves. Although later, and I don't know if this is the time to talk about this, I think that person is going to be possibly, and I think I've seen this often, they're walking away not getting what they needed or what they wanted. I think that's going to cause problems later.
Yeah, definitely. Each of these conflict styles, they have a anticipatory element to them. I mean, we often know that we're going to be walking into a situation where we're going to be disagreeing with each other or having some conflict. So again, with the competitor, anticipation is often anticipating in advance areas of disagreement and preparing responses to those objections. With the accommodator, they might be anticipating how the conversation could damage the relationship here and identifies ways in advance to maintain harmony.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's interesting because this is sort of a side note, but it's very true also for behavior styles. It's not a surprise that these people tend to become friends. By these people, I mean competitors and accommodators. It might seem really counterintuitive, but at least in relationships, it's really common for these folks to match up with each other and to be, to really become attracted to one another initially and get together and get married and get into relationship. Because there is that sense that, again, when trust and respect are high, we kind of see these things that we really admire about the other person, and it kind of fits, and we, kind of like two puzzle pieces kind of fit together. Over time, of course, if there's not some work done on, working toward collaboration, these exact same differences can really be a problem in the relationship.
Right. Yeah. Well said.
Let's move on, and I'll throw this one back to you. Let's talk about avoider now. So we've got the competitor, again, high on goals, low on relationship, accommodator, low on goals, high on relationship, and now we've got the avoider who tends to be low on both. Tell us about that, Ethan?
Well, let me tell you about that. The avoider is someone that's generally going to have kind of this a leave, lose, let the other person win orientation. The name kind of describes it, right? They're not necessarily going to be the person that accommodates to you and maintains a relationship, but they're just going to avoid it altogether. So they tend to be they're not very assertive, and they're also not very cooperative. So in a sense, they're willing to let go of their own goals and let go of the relationship at the same time. Again, so they're pursuing neither goals or the concerns of the other person. At the end of the day, they're the people that are going to leave the issue unaddressed by usually skillfully. This is how they've approached conflict throughout their whole lives, skillfully sidestepping the debate or the disagreement, just continue to postpone it. They might be people that say, hey, let's talk about this later. Then when it's time, hey, I can't do it right now. Right? Or just withdrawing altogether. Kind of, they just shut down and they're not nodding that, yeah, you're right. I think good point, nor are they arguing with you. They're just kind of shutting down. So, some characteristics of an avoider right there. But if you're in a conversation with an avoider, what behaviors might you see from them?
I think you nailed it. I especially backing up to kind of a group, what you're going to see in a group setting. I just think most likely this person just seems to be disengaged, right? I would call it, I think you used the word shutdown. I think it looks like that. It's a person who may be quite internally engaged. Like they might be tracking everything and they might be having all sorts of opinions. But the way it shows up is they're not attending to the relationship. They're not doing any kind of active listening, like you said, and they're also not stating their opinions. And so they end up just looking like they're not involved. They're not engaged. It can be frustrating to have that person involved in a group setting. Sometimes even when you try to draw them out, it's often quite unsuccessful. In a one-on-one, I think it's even more pronounced, right? It's the person who just kind of, sure, whatever, shuts down. They don't seem very caring about you, but they also don't seem to be pursuing what they want.
Yeah. It's the type of person, as far as what they're anticipating in advance of getting into this conversation, they'll be anticipating already that the conversation could turn a little bit contentious and maybe tries to just find someone else to settle the disagreement, or, hey, somebody else go and make the decision. I don't want to be a part of this debate here. That person that might say something like, hey, I just don't have time for this right now. Like I don't want to do this. Now, I have a bit of a theory on this, and I'd be curious to know what you think about it. But I think as far as the conflict styles of a leader of a group, I think avoider can be the most damaging in a sense if this is what they really lean into. Because a group is going to model their leader, the person with the power differential. And I've seen this before, and I know you've seen that as well, Mike, but the leader that as soon as things start, the conflict or the disagreement starts to bubble up in a team meeting, and they say something like, we don't have time for this right now. Let's not and so it shuts it all down. And everybody gets the message that conflict, debate is not safe. It's not okay. We can't do it. And that's how we kind of go into that artificial harmony. So I think in a sense, it could be the most damaging to the overall success and performance of the team if the leader is not careful and their default mode is avoider. Now, of course, at the same time, you could probably apply that to the competitor, right? If they're super competitive and when there is a debate, they're taking center stage and they're not asking questions and they're really trying to win, that can be damaging as well. But I think it's a little bit easier to claw back from that because people are still seeing, okay, debate is and conflict is accepted here clearly with the competitor leader, but with the avoider, it's like it's not welcome at all. We just don't do that. So I don't know. That's a theory that I've been kind of twiddling around on for a while. I'd be curious to know what you think about that.
Well, twiddling around on a theory is a great phrase. I want to use that someday. Yeah. You know what, Ethan, I'm going to agree and disagree with you. Let's have some disagreement in our podcast about disagreeing. I would say, first, let me tell you where I agree with you. Absolutely, when a leader definitely is leaning heavily into the avoider style, yes, I think I will. I won't say everything you just said. I will just highlight the phrase that they give the message that any kind of disagreement and conflict is absolutely not okay, and we're not going to go there, and they just move us on. I think that's really damaging to the outcomes for sure. Like meaning that they're just not going to get anywhere. Often that leader, I think, is going to go make their own decisions separately because they're just not able to do that kind of work in a group setting. So I agree with you. I think where I disagree is that it's like the most damaging. I absolutely don't agree with that. And I'll just say why. I actually think the three: competitor, accommodator, avoider. Those three, if leaned into heavily, are all extremely damaging equally, but in very different ways. The competitor, for example, who really leans into that as a leader, and I've seen this before, they absolutely destroy psychological safety in their group. And so, yeah, they might be saying conflict's okay, but actually they're not, because what I've seen happen is it's okay for them to do conflict. Like they get to fight and argue and push, but when someone else does it in the group, they do it right back to them, and the power differential kind of takes over, and it becomes people just shut down. And so, yeah, I think all three of them are not. I mean, in fact, I think this is a lesson for managers, right? I mean, it's more important as a leader to get a handle on what your default mode is and work toward collaboration.
Nice, good. Well, so okay, so those are maybe the dangers of a leader. That's their default mode, is to be the avoider, and the dangers the leader is just a competitor without making any adjustments. What might be the dangers of the leader, or maybe pitfalls is the better way to look at it, of a leader that's default mode is the accommodator, right? The one with the yield lose, let the other person win orientation.
Yeah. I think they're going to probably show up certainly very relational and wanting people to be heard. There's some really good things about that for sure, but they're going to have a really low tolerance for disagreement in a team. They're going to be probably overly concerned about how people are feeling and getting people being treated right and having all their needs met, to the degree that I think decisions don't get made. And so this is the person who's probably going to do a lot of consensus, not make decisions because they don't want to offend anybody. It can lead to a lot of frustration in teams because this person doesn't seem to be kind of willing to take a leadership role in many ways. So I think all three of those different styles can lead to some bad outcomes when the leader is not, working on their collaboration skills.
Let's talk about the compromiser, which is our fourth conflict style here. We touched on it briefly at the start of this episode, but the compromiser is, and again, sounds kind of positive, right? I think, at least where I stand, I hear compromiser and I hear that as a positive thing, to come to a compromise. And it is in some cases. But a compromiser is someone that, hey, we'll each take a small win and we'll each take a small loss. That's the idea. So they're kind of right in the middle, like you said earlier. They're right in the middle of assertiveness and right in the middle of cooperativeness. So they're mild in both of those. They're maybe more likely to pursue a more expedient solution that only partially satisfies both parties. Now, behaviors. What would you see if you're engaged in a disagreement with a compromiser? What do you think?
Well, I think something you just said was actually good for me to hear. I think they are going to be a little expedient, actually, now that I think about it. Let's just get to it, even if that means you and me giving up some things. And so I think there might be some expedience there. But I think you're going to see more of the kind of the willingness to accept that we're going to walk away disappointed, and I'm okay with that. But I'm also, we're going to give up some things and I'm okay with that. I don't know. It's hard to explain that for me. I mean, I don't have the words for it. Maybe a little lack of passion sometimes, or maybe a lack of, hey, let's get really creative here. Let's think outside the box. Maybe a little bit of lack of energy. I'm kind of spitballing here.
Yeah, I mean, I think a compromiser as someone, it's just going to show up super neutral and mild in a sense, right? They're not going to rock the boat, right? They're not going to totally let you have whatever you want, but they're also going to be okay, with them not getting everything they want. And again, that sounds positive, but I think the issue with the compromiser is that people tend to walk away feeling like just dissatisfied with where it went. It's like, we didn't get to another alternative creative outcome with compromiser. I think because of that expedience. I think because of that, over time, this can wear on people. Because at some level, maybe they would have, some people think, hey, I think we could have come to a more sound or even a more aggressive decision here. But because we're not taking any risks with the compromiser. We just get maybe a more watered down version of decisions, in a sense, is how I've often seen it show up.
Yeah, that's good. I also want to do a little in defense of the compromiser. So I want to give a little bit. It's not a alternative or contrary way of looking at this. It kind of supports the idea that we've said earlier that it's not a bad place to be, right? I mean, you don't want to be leaning into avoider or accommodator or competitor for sure. Lots of times compromising is really where you just need to be there. And there's nothing wrong with that either. And I just want to kind of make sure that our listeners hear that, really good compromise work can be done it can be done really well, where you're going for consensus and people are, find that they're willing to give up a few things. They can support the final decision. We're all happy with that. So again, I don't want to make compromiser sound like it's at the same sort of unhealthy level as the other three. It just isn't the best in some situations. You can, in many cases, as you just said, you could spend a little bit more time on it and get to collaboration. So,
yeah. And I think if you put it in contrast to the collaborator, right? The collaborator is win-win orientation, which, as we've said several times now, that implies that we're getting creative and learning from each other. With the compromiser being, we'll each win some and we'll each lose some. Yeah, like you said, that's going to be maybe needed and necessary in some cases. But the idea that we can both win and be happy with this is what gets us to the best solution. So I like what you said there. It's like, it's not bad. It's not super negative, but it's like we can do better in a lot of cases by getting to collaborator. And so let's talk about that one. Let's dive into collaborator, right? Again, the note here is that this is the ideal state to get to. Is it always possible in every situation? No. But if we're all coming in with the idea of the win-win, we'll get to some pretty cool and out-of-the-box solutions. So the collaborator, again, they're both assertive and they're cooperative at the same time. They're pursuing the alternative creative solution that fully satisfies both parties, which again implies thinking outside the box and not thinking there's either A or B, but there might be C, D, E, and so on. They're going to be really interested in exploring those areas of disagreement and then learning from each other. That's the collaborator.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, the collaborator, it's that idea that you're going for what you want, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. That's you're willing to continue forward to get what you're interested in, to have your goals met, but you're also willing to make sure the other person is truly heard, and you want them to get what they want too, right? And in trying to accomplish both of those goals, you may arrive somewhere totally different. I like the way you said that earlier. Like, I'm going for A and you're going for B, and I'm going to keep going for A, and I want you to keep going for B, and I'm going to listen and I'm going to ask questions, and you're going to listen and ask questions, and we may discover that there's actually a C, right? That is even better. But I like that idea that we're focusing on the relationship, meaning what the other person wants and needs and how they're feeling, but we're also focused on what we think is right. And you're kind of willing to stay in it. And to do that, and I think this is where it gets interesting, to stay in it, you both have to be using really good adaptive skills, because if you're not, the other person can't stay in it. And that's really the point here on collaboration. If I'm showing up in a way that makes it easier for you to show up, we're both going to be able to stay in there without our sympathetic nervous systems getting involved and our amygdala getting involved and us having to kind of go into fight, flight, or freeze.
Yeah, that's really good. And Stephen Covey, in his book that everybody's probably aware of, right, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, I mean, one of those habits is pursuing the win-win. Mm-hmm. And I like how he explains it, that in solving for the win-win, we have to consider two factors, which is consideration and courage.
Ooh, nice.
And so the win-win is high consideration for the other person's goals and high courage, right? Because it's the courage that is what it takes to stay engaged in that conversation. And it might not be expedient, right? This one takes time to get to the win-win. So I have to have the courage to hang in there, to state what I need clearly, and to have the courage to work with another person that we might not be seeing eye to eye on. So it's high consideration and high courage. He also has another concept in this chapter, which is the win-win or no deal. Now, I don't think this is a realistic approach in every circumstance, but it's something that I think teams can consider. So the win-win or no deal is the belief that if we can't achieve a mutually satisfactory outcome, it's better to have no deal right now. And what that does is it forces the team to keep working on it. And I like that, right? Given that we don't have to make a decision like right now, this hour or today, I like the idea that, hey, we're not going to settle until we can find a win-win. Now, I think for really healthy teams, that's very reasonable and that's achievable. So I like how he explains that. And I think win-win is just a mindset to have in life in general, that we don't have to have someone else lose for us to win.
I want to go back to what you said about consideration and courage. I just love those two words to describe this style, because you are really emphasizing in consideration the relationship, and you're emphasizing your own goals in courage. And I think consideration and courage should be the title of this podcast, Ethan. I think that's really, really good. The other thing you said, which is great, is just having that goal up front, whether it's a relationship, and, I'm back to, partner and I discussing some, differences we have about how we want to do our vacation, or a work group trying to arrive at a decision. Having the idea up front that, hey, we're going to go for win-win here. And we may end up going to compromise. That's a possibility, but we are going for win-win. Like that's really something to be said right up front in the relationship, in the disagreement, in the group. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. And let me just add one more thing to that, is that I think to get a whole team to get on board with this win-win orientation, there has to be this abundance mindset, which Stephen Covey also talks about, right? The abundance mentality is really necessary for creating that win-win situations. The abundance mindset really is the belief that, hey, there's enough of everything to go around, including resources, including opportunities, including success. And so people with this mentality, the abundance mentality, they just tend to be more open-minded. They tend to be more flexible. They tend to be more creative. And it's that mindset that I think fosters collaboration and fosters cooperation, which ultimately is going to allow people to work together to achieve success for all parties here. So it's the win-win orientation where we have high consideration and high courage, and we're all practicing this abundance mindset. There's enough to go around for everybody. So how can we be flexible and creative to get to our solutions?
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that. So if you're in conversation with a collaborator, you're watching collaborators in a meeting, for example, what are you seeing? Just behaviorally, what kind of behaviors are showing up, would you say?
Well, you're going to see a lot of deep and sincere questions. Like, you're going to see a lot of curiosity in general. Mm-hmm. Hey, let me understand where you're coming from.
Right.
What would have to change? What would be another way of looking at this? Right. It's really this I want to understand type of questions. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, you're going to get a lot of, hey, let me state clearly what I think. Right. Let me make sure if I'm not getting, a voice here, that I'm going to be allowed to have a voice and explain where I'm coming from. Mm-hmm. And then I see a lot of inviting other people to ask questions. What doesn't make sense about this, folks? What do I need to clarify? What am I missing here? Mm-hmm. And so I see a lot of questions mixed in with, again, that courage to make sure that you have a voice here at this table.
I love
what else? Part. What do you see?
Well, first, I love that part you just said about, I don't know how you worded it again, but encouraging others to ask you, what am I missing? Right. Please disagree with me. Right. I love that. So you're asking questions, you're encouraging others to push back or disagree. You're, like you said, you're showing some courage. You're saying what you want and need, what you think. I think you're also going to see what I call graceful disagreement. You're going to see people that are less likely to just brush people off or say something, unkind about the opinion they just heard, or say you're wrong, and you're going to have people more likely to say, hey, that makes sense. Let me share the way I'm seeing it. Right. I see it differently than you see it. So there's just, it's in the wording, it's in the tone. And by the way, we can't miss tone, right? You're going to have a tone that I'm not going to say it's always calm, right? It's okay to get into a little bit of a debate and get kind of excited, right? And have a little bit of passion, but it doesn't cross the line into what I think people would consider to be aggressiveness and, again, the interrupting and maybe the talking over people and, maybe sarcasm, things like that. So again, lots of adaptive skills. What else? What am I missing? What are we missing here?
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, and this is maybe a slightly different topic, an adjacent topic, but I also see when everybody's engaging in that win-win mindset, collaborative mindset, that we're also able to bounce back when people do step over the line.
Yes.
Right? Because things get emotional. We're human beings. We're not perfect, and we're all going to have, again, our default conflict style. So for myself, I might start getting into my competitive style, and then I start to raise my voice a little bit and get louder, and I start to interrupt. But it's a group that can say, hey, let's step back for a second, right? And then let's recover from that, as opposed to, well, now this whole process is in the can, right? It's thrown off. And so I think when we're collaborative, we're also having grace and empathy for each other, because we're willing to hang in there and come back to the table and get back on track.
You are describing relationships that are elastic and not brittle right there. Mm-hmm. And that's really good. You can stretch a bit, it can get uncomfortable, but you can come right back. And so in that case, you're going to see, hey, like you said, hey, can we step back a little bit? You might even see someone say, hey, can you let me finish? Right? People kind of claiming their space. You might see an apology, right? The person who, let's say, like you're saying, who was getting loud and maybe a little more aggressive says, hey, you know what? My bad. I apologize. Go ahead and keep talking, right? It's that ability to notice it or call it out, right? And then recover, maybe through an apology or a kind of backtrack a little bit. And then we can just go on. We don't have to get stuck. We just had this misstep. Now we have to stop and diagnose and, feel shame. And you don't have to do that. You just can recover quickly. I love that.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I think that's a good place to leave it for today. What do you think?
Yeah, really good. There's so much more. And I think we will continue this conversation.
We're going to have part 3 coming up next. But I think the punchline here, which is what's going to be the theme of our next episode, is that, imagine if every person in a work group, or a family for that matter, understood their default conflict style and the conflict style of their colleagues or family members around them. And then everybody was working on making some adjustments. This would create the conditions for respectful collaboration and really better results. And I think that's the goal here. That's what we're aiming for. So in the next episode, we're going to get into those. We're going to get into some adjustments. Like behavioral styles, I think there are kind of some go-to adjustments that each conflict style can make. Again, painting with broad strokes here. But if we coach people with different conflict styles, we're going to talk about, hey, most often these might be the adjustments an avoider might want to make, or a competitor might need to make in order to get closer to that collaborator mode. So that's where we're going to go next. Besides that, thanks for tuning in, folks. I want to encourage you all to sign up for our mostly monthly Managing with Mind and Heart newsletter, share articles, tips for managers and leaders, and just living a good life in general and building strong relationships. If you'd like to get on that newsletter, you can simply text the word leading to the number 66866. We'll see you here next episode to continue this conversation.